All right, let's take this discussion on the Zimbabwean elections a little bit further. I'm joined now by a very distinguished panel of guests who will help us unpack what the situation is. Let's start with you, Dr. Raftopoulos. Now, we're already beginning to see at this stage preliminary results coming up. What are you reading from them?
Well, I think a number of things. Firstly, of course, the results look like it's going to be almost a landslide for ZANU-PF. And that, of course, raises many questions. Why? I think it's a combination of factors. Firstly, it's the manner in which the ZANU-PF has behaved and carried out its own actions during the GPA. It has at every stage stalled the reform process within the GPA. It has gone against key SADC resolutions, and it has frustrated key reforms, democratic reforms, particularly around media, public association, selective application of justice, and therefore that itself has been an obstacle.
But having said so, Professor, what we're hearing from the African Union at this stage at least is that these elections appear to be credible. They're declaring them as free and fair.
I think because the main criteria for them has been the absence of overt violence, in particular in comparison to the runoff in 2008. And of course, that was the key ZANU-PF strategy, was to not run it in the same way they did in 2008, but to have a much more subtle strategy. And particularly we've seen that strategy working throughout the period of the GPA. One shouldn't also, of course, discount that ZANU-PF does have a social base. They do have a support base based on their what has happened on the land, based on the legacy of the liberation. So I think it's a combination of factors.
So, Bettina Gappa, can we really be skeptical about these elections? The question that I'm asking is, are these elections free and fair?
Thank you, Chris. I think Brian is absolutely right. And as far as I'm concerned, skepticism is the only appropriate response to this.
Why?
Because,
why should we be skeptical?
You have to go back to 2008. As Brian said, that was a very violent election, especially after the preliminary results were announced and we saw ourselves in a runoff. It was a violent election. Rural areas were shut down. People were beaten and cowed into submission. So what the AU is simply doing now is to use that as a litmus test as to whether these elections are credible or not. But if they use there's no violence in Zimbabwe result as the reason to declare these elections credible, they would be setting the bar extremely low for African elections. And we've already seen this in Kenya, by the way. Kenya also had a contested election that was followed by yet another contested election, but because there was no violence, the AU declared that election to be as credible as it's probably going to declare our election in Zimbabwe.
So are we seeing the development of a set piece here by the region? If your elections aren't violent, therefore your elections ergo must be free and fair?
Absolutely. First of all, you are violent to cow your opposition into submission, go into some sort of GPA, and then you become resurgent, you become stronger, and then you bludgeon them into submission using other means that are not violence. And that's how you stay in power for more than the allotted time that you're supposed to have.
A very tough indictment coming from Bettina Gappa. Dr. Mandaza, do you agree, first of all, with this assessment? But why should we believe all of these statements that are coming out from our other guests? Surely there must be another perspective here.
It's worse than that. This is a demonstration of impunity at the highest level. You are telling the people who have voted in one direction that they don't matter. We don't care a damn about you. You think you don't like us? We don't like you either. Your vote is stolen, period. It's as bad as that.
A stolen vote. You are essentially...
No, listen,
but if you're going to say that, Dr. Mandaza, you must provide evidence. If the vote is stolen, how?
First of all, there's a pattern. It's known for the last 20 years that the urban areas, in particular, but the provinces like Manicaland, Mashingo, have run away from ZANU-PF long ago. And what does the impunity do? You go into the heartland of so-called opposition and you rig the elections.
So, Professor Raftopoulos, if then we are to believe what Dr. Mandaza has said, have the people then every right to basically essentially feel let down, not just by the region if they don't declare this election unfair, but simply the system itself run by the ZEC. Take us through that.
Look, as I said, I think when I said a combination of factors, I think one shouldn't discount that ZANU-PF also has a support base. I wouldn't be saying that they would have no strong showing in this election. But the kind of figures that are coming through do raise very serious questions. And the problems that were raised before the elections around the registration, the voters' roll, the special vote, these all gave an indication of the problems that were likely to come, which SADC noted itself. I think the real danger here is the message that this process sends. The message being that if you're in opposition and if you win votes and if you win majority votes, you still won't be able to translate that into state power. And what does that mean for the region? If it gets endorsed by regional organizations or continental organizations, the message it sends is that electoral politics have no substance. And that is very dangerous.
Now, Patina Gapa, the interesting thing here is that President Robert Mugabe went on record saying all of this complaining is from crybabies, and here he was referring to Morgan Tsvangirai's criticism around these procedural and electoral and logistical problems. What do you have to say about that? Is it a case of crybabies?
No, I've been engaging with a lot of ZANU-PF supporters, including people who are actually responsible for some of the mess that we're seeing. And I've asked one very simple question. If ZANU-PF was so confident of a victory, why was it necessary to flout just about every electoral regulation and law leading up to this election? And not one person has been able to answer that question. I agree with Brian that, ZANU-PF does have significant support. It really does. But it's not significant enough, I think, for them to have won an election cleanly and fairly. And as early as January, I was actually quite despondent and confident that ZANU-PF was going to walk away with a credible result. But unfortunately, they have not. They have chosen to flout the law. I'll give you an example. There's a councillor in, I think it's Chegutu, a small town in central Zimbabwe, who is not on the voters' roll. Now, normally that would have been rectified, because before you are even declared as a candidate by the nomination court, you have to be on the voters' roll. But we didn't have that process. Only the day before the election did the opposition parties get a copy of the voters' roll, a hard copy, and not an electronic copy like the law actually says. So there were a lot of shenanigans, I would say, around the voters' roll that make you question really the credibility of this election.
So then, Professor Mandaza, if what we are hearing appears to be the case, what is the advice that you would be giving to the region as a way to solve this situation? And secondly, what do you say to Zimbabweans now?
Well, I think the first thing that is that I've just heard that the MDC have declared that these elections were not free and fair. They don't recognize, they don't accept the results, and they are calling on SADC and AU to declare the elections null and void. I'd agree with that position.
And how about the people of Zimbabwe? What do you say to them?
They'll be glad to hear that. Unless they hear that, then they will feel very let down by the region and the continent and the international community.
So has this government of national unity, which was developed after yet another failed election in 2008, amounted to essentially a waste of time?
Look, I wouldn't say it's a waste of time, but I will say that what it has allowed ZANU-PF to do is to get strength and to become a resurgent party. Mugabe had no legitimacy until Tsvangirai agreed to go into the GPA with him. But his party has been acting like they are the legitimate government. And even when the MDC was in opposition, it was always seen and treated as a junior partner with absolutely no importance to the government.
So is there anything to be said for the case that maybe the MDC was caught napping in this election? Maybe they didn't do the right groundwork to ensure that they could effectively have a credible election which could result in an outcome that would have been more credible according to what we've been hearing.
That might be that MDC didn't do enough. But in retrospect, I think that they could never have done enough. These guys are not going anywhere. They are there to stay, they think. They would defy anything. And this proves it. The impunity with which they've done this one means that they don't care. And the statement by Mugabe that if, for example, if SADC does declare, which it should, that this election are null and void, you can't rule out Mugabe pulling out of SADC.
Stay tuned to Africa 360 as we give you the latest on the Zimbabwean elections.
I'm not going to concede defeat over this. I can only honestly concede defeat in an honest contest.